Hey everybody, listen to the Katana Podcast with me, Invisible Katana, and today I have two really big subjects that are very important to me as a gamer. And the first one is video games that just come out and they're really disappointing to you. It's not that the game just sucks, it's like not just it's a bad game, but like a game you're super excited for. Maybe the last one was really great. And just like, with movies, it's like, all right, you love the first one, you're really excited for the sequel, and it comes out and it's just not what it was meant to be. And typically speaking, that all happens because games get rushed out the gate. So it's not too crazy that it happens, and in fact it happens a bunch because games get rushed out of the gate so often. And it's like, oh, the holidays are coming up, especially the holiday thing, like, oh, it's the end of the year, it's the big Christmas sales and all that stuff. That is probably the number one contributor to these games are being rushed. Like, this set of games this year is getting rushed, and it's typically because like we're almost there and we could honestly just take a good couple of months and come out next year, but instead we want to push this thing out right now and just get swept up in those really big sales and get like an extra amount of money because it's easier to afford, instead of going with the long run where you'll have a great video game like, say, Mortal Kombat or something, and if they rush that and it wasn't amazing like it currently is, it wouldn't have amazing sales, and it wouldn't have a price range of, like, I think it still costs like $20, and that's typically as cheap as games will get. But people wouldn't care about that game in any way, shape, or form if it wasn't still amazing, if they didn't take the time to put that game out and they just rushed it like nothing mattered, and then we got like a crappy Mortal Kombat game, and then it's just like, well, yeah, it's sold here, but really, who gives a crap? Like, no one's really gonna buy it anymore after that initial burst because it doesn't get good reviews and stuff like that. So, I have a couple examples that I really wanted to talk about. And the one that I really, really want to discuss is the Dead Island franchise. Now, I have both the Dead Island games, or I have the first two, since technically we have a new one that just came out, Escape Dead Island. And I like the Dead Island games. They're nothing like the trailers, of course. Like, the first trailer came out and it blew everybody away, and it was just like the game was nothing like that because that super dramatic stuff didn't really happen. It had like, I think there were like two moments where that actually happened in the entire game, but that's about it. Like, there was nothing insanely special or emotional or anything like that. It was just a good, fun RPG game. If it was, promoted the way that the game actually played, I think people would have even less of a problem with it, because the main issue people do tend to have is the fact that it's nothing like that trailer. Like, it had such a emotional feel to it, and then you play the game and it's really like nothing at all. It has zero emotional ties to it, for the most part, at least. But I love those games. I love the first one. I was really excited to play it. When I played it, I still personally enjoyed it. It's insanely ridiculous. Like, it's got stereotypes in it. All the people kind of look the same. All the people kind of sound the same. It's really got some issues there. But ultimately, it's a super fun game to play, honestly. It's like just a great zombie bashing RPG style game. You have the weapon customizations, you have all the cool mods where it's like, one hit kills depending on how fast the zombies are coming at you. If you time it right, chop their heads off, breaking bones, all sorts of crazy mods. You can even mod guns to shoot fire and this and that. And it's super fun. Like, I love doing that. And that's what makes the game worth playing, like multiple times even, because you can play with the different characters and get their special abilities that are unique to them, and then play on multiplayer and things like that. And it's actually pretty fun. A ton of cool little secrets. You can find a ton of random people, and it's just a fun game. And then Dead Island Riptide came out, which was the sequel, and I was really excited for that. I was like, okay, they're adding a fifth character that you can play as. That's pretty cool. And, it just continues the story on right where the first game left off. I was pretty excited for it. I was like, I know it's not going to be the biggest thing ever, stuff like that, but I was still excited to play. The reviews pretty much said what I expected. The graphics were pretty much exactly the same. All the same issues were still there. Like, the people still look the same. Mostly all still sound the same and stuff like that. And it's like, I expected that, honestly. I didn't expect it to be amazing. And even with my expectations lower than normal, where it's like I'm super excited. I was just like, I'm gonna enjoy it because of the concept or what I know, the heart of the game is, which is mod these weapons and just eventually get to like this super high status where you can just wipe out all these zombies coming at you. Even with that, when I got the game, I was still really disappointed. There was so much stuff that I personally felt was missing from the game, and there was stuff that really, just from a design standpoint, really was missing. And I did a video on this a long time ago where I kind of compared the first Dead Island to Dead Island Riptide, and overall I like the first one better because the second Dead Island game just skipped out on so much. Like, this character's not really being any different. Everyone's still, for the most part, you have like 20 guys in the whole game. They just have like slightly different shades and a little bit of difference here, but still sound the same. That didn't even bother me nearly as much as the fact that there was stuff taken out of the game. Like, there were mods from the first game that they actually didn't even put back into the sequel, which just seems ridiculous. Like, you have this data and all that stuff, you can kind of just transfer it, and it's not like they redid the engine or anything. They basically transferred everything else anyway, the character designs and the way the characters move around, stuff like that. All of that was carried over, but they took out some of the weapon mods. The game itself, it's much, much smaller than the very first game, which was probably my least favorite part about it. There's just so much that the first game had. It's like you have the hotel portion, you have the giant beach portion, which is all kind of the same actual area, but they're like, I believe, 3 or 4 separate locations in the first game. You have the resort, they have the big jungle portion where a section of the story takes place, which admittedly was always my least favorite, and that's how the first part of the game, or the second game, that's the first part of it, is like the jungle section. So it kind of was like, crap, my least favorite part of the first game is the first section of the second game. But you go to other areas, but they still didn't have nearly as much. They weren't nearly as big. Like, one of the areas was literally just, it was just the connecting point. Like, it could have easily have been, one separate area, or it could have just been attached to another area, but it's like, this is where the boat area is. So that's pretty much it. It's like a dock and then a little pathway leading up to some caves or like some sewers. And the sewers count as their own area. And the sewers are admittedly fairly big, but it's also sewers. It's just like dark, dank sewers, and it's creepy. But the point of the game really is to have fun and see this super cool, like, zombie paradise, mashup thing. And when you have just zombies in a sewer, it's like, yeah, it's really creepy because it's dark and it's hard to see. But the main point of the entire game is like, look at this beautiful paradise, and then they're just dead people and zombies running all over the place. That's the point, and like the real big attraction initially, or visually at least, to the Dead Island franchise, is seeing this beautiful visual locale and then all these crazy zombies. And it's like, yeah, well, a sewer, like, I don't care. So the second game had so much that really upset me. It was like, there's stuff in the game, there's missions in the game that you can find stuff for, but they didn't put the missions in. Like, there's a really big thing, and I even had to look this up because I found this area. I was just walking around, there were just locations, there were buildings I hadn't been to yet, and one of the buildings actually had a name. Like, whenever there's a title for an apartment and it has someone's name, it's like, okay, well, this has somebody's name to it. It's like this person's apartment. That means it's very special. It's not just some random place, or it's not just like apartment B or anything like that. It had a person's full name, and then it said it's their apartment. So I was like, oh, this will be cool. It's going to be a boss or something. Like, they named it after the boss in this building. And I went through the building. There were some zombies. I killed them, and I was like, well, it was weird that it was titled after a certain person who isn't in the main story or anything like that. And I found this person's actual apartment inside of the apartment building, and there were pictures of the main character, and there was this computer set up, and there was nothing. Like, I had already beaten the game, and I just went back because it was, it was like, okay, there are a couple of things I didn't do. There were a few places I wanted to explore before finishing up the game. So after I beat it, I went back and I checked out a couple of these places, and this place had pictures of all the main characters. Like I said, it was titled after an actual person who wasn't in the game at all. And I was like, I had no idea what to think. I'm like, why is this here? Like, what's happening? So I looked it up, And it was just something that was meant to be in the game. And it was a whole section. They built the area, they just didn't put it into the story for whatever reason. And once again, it would have to be the fact that the game was being rushed out. And it really upset me. It was like, man, they built the portion, they named it after the character. And I know that's like some of the easiest stuff you could do is like, digitally create some pictures in the computer and a little title that pops up. I understand that that's the most basic form of what it takes to incorporate an entire character into the main story of a game. But it was disappointing. Like, that was in there. There was just a giant portion of the entire map that you couldn't get to. And that, like I said, with the maps being, overall the second game being much smaller than the first game, that was one of the big things. And this was in my favorite area, which was like the city portion of the video game. There was just a lot on the map that you could see, and you could find these areas. It was just like you could look out and it's like, oh, there's the rest of this giant city, but it just doesn't involve you. Like, there's nothing in the main story campaign. You can't just free roam and get over to these big chunks. It's like, this is where you are in this city, and that's it. And it was a small portion compared to, like I said, even what you could see on the map. There was a ton of stuff, and I understand that they can't just make it go on forever and forever, but it was just minuscule compared to what they visually showed you. It's just so much extra that you could see, and it's like, I can't get over here. And there was a lot to explore. There wasn't, super tiny, but compared to the first game, and having played Dead Island 1 and going through like just the first portion of the original Dead Island game, even that first map felt bigger than the entire second game to me. And it's really sad that that's the case. Like, there was the actual hotel that you could go into. They had a mission where you go into like the garage and stuff, and then there's multiple safe houses that you get to within just this one map, and it was huge. And then the second game, all three maps are like the size of just the first portion of the first game, and it was very disappointing to me. And not to just stick on Dead Island, but that was the one that really brought this subject to mind, and that's why I'm doing it for this podcast. Was I was just thinking about that game, and of course the new Dead Island game, which everyone pretty much hates. That in general is not disappointing. That was just a bad game. I don't think anyone was really expecting that to be super amazing or anything. And if you're listening to this and you happen to get Escape Dead Island and you were hoping for it to be great, then of course share your thoughts down in the comment section below, like how it disappointed you, which admittedly I would kind of have to assume is in almost every single way. But Dead Island is just that really big game, or Dead Island Riptide I should say. It's just that game where I still love it. I still love the weapons and stuff like that, but even though the story to the first game wasn't a big deal, even in this one, the story is a bit lackluster, and some things are just weird. Like, they explain stuff that you already had in the first game as if this is the first time it ever happened, and the characters do it all throughout the first game, and then you unlock it again in the second, and it's like, what is this amazing thing? And it's like, why wasn't this in the first game when they first did that, and stuff like that, just weird things. But ultimately that game just really disappointed me. And then we have, of course, other stuff that comes out where it disappoints people temporarily, and I think the only reason it's temporary is because now we live in the world of everything's just online, all the time. So we, of course, have patches and things like that to help out with all the crazy bugs and things like that. So there are certain things that come out, like the new Assassin's Creed game, Unity specifically, since there were two. Unity had like bug after bug after bug, but they patched that up, fortunately. And of course, with a ton of other games that come out super buggy, they patch those things up. Then there are other games that come out, like the new Sonic game, of course. And that, I don't know how many people were really excited for it. It seemed like Sonic was really on the rise. We were doing good with Generations. I don't know how the last game went. The last one I actually do think went down. I think everyone loved Generations. And then the next one came out, and it wasn't as good as everyone was hoping for. It was like a cool new aspect to it where all the worlds are like tubes and you can move in and out and stuff. It looked really cool for sure. Like, I love the design of it. It looked really sweet. And it kind of went downhill. It didn't do terrible, but it did go downhill. And then, Sonic Boom comes out, and it was bad. Like, it just across the board, had a lot of crappy stuff. It had crappy mechanics, and once again, I guess this doesn't technically coincide with things being uh, games coming out and they're disappointing to people. Like I said, I don't know how many people were really thinking Sonic Boom was just going to be unbelievable, but I don't think anyone really expected it to be as bad as it was. And you could watch a ton of playthroughs where just all these simple issues come up. They have all sorts of weird things going on inside of the actual video cutscenes where they're moving stuff around, or some things move and some things don't, and characters like jump within the cutscene, and it's very unnatural. They move like an entire foot to the left or right within the cutscene, and you might miss it because it's like, half a second, like three crazy weird things happen, and you're just playing the game. It's like, all right, it loaded up, and you're shooting off like Sonic. But it's just one of those things that it came out and it disappointed everybody, I think. And it just goes in line with like just disappointing things. And it kind of sucks that happens, of course, because as someone who loves video games, you always want all the games to come out and everything's just amazing. Even if you don't play the game, you kind of just want it to be good because it's a video game. It's like, I just want games to be great so that more people play them, and then more games get made because I love games. But disappointing games coming out, and it's been happening for decades. Of course, it's happened. Back when Atari came out, I'm sure everyone was like, E.T. the video game, and then, if you don't play games, then you probably don't get that joke. But if you do, then E.T. is like, what E.T. is. And for those who don't, E.T. is basically considered like the worst video game ever made, and it was even dumped, like all the unsold cartridges were dumped in a landfill in Mexico, which was recently uncovered. So that was actually kind of cool. And those cartridges are actually being sold on eBay now, or they have been for a while. But games coming out and being disappointing is of course disappointing, but there are just sometimes, like the Dead Island thing for me is one that really sticks out. Another huge one, and this is because I love Resident Evil, is my favorite franchise. Resident Evil Survivor, when that first came out, was incredibly disappointing for me. It was the first Resident Evil, I think, that was really, really bad. And it wasn't like, it sucks because it's on, it's the Game Boy version. So those you can kind of let slide. It's just, those are admittedly like the cash grab things where, it's going to look like crap compared to a freaking PlayStation. But it's the Game Boy, so you can't really hate it. And you know it's going to look like crap compared to the PlayStation, so you can't really be disappointed by it. But Resident Evil Survivor comes out after Resident Evil 2, which was an amazing sequel to the first great Resident Evil game, and it kind of destroyed people. I think it was like, what is this first person crap? You have unlimited ammo with the handgun and stuff like that, and it was like a rail shooter, sort of, because I think if I remember right, you could actually move around. And I played it around the time it first came out. My cousin actually had it, and I was like, holy crap, because even back then, Resident Evil was my favorite franchise. And I was like, man, Resident Evil, the new Resident Evil. And I played it, and I was really, really upset by it. And I was like, what the heck? This really, really sucks. And I was really disappointed by that. Unfortunately, things have gone up, and I guess at this point in time, it's kind of teetering. They have like Revelations 2 coming out, which I'm really excited for. And then, we have the main numbered franchise, which has kind of gone downhill since 4. And, 4 was, like, a really great game. I love Resident Evil 4 and stuff like that. And then 5 came out, and I was really, really disappointed by 5 because there was nothing suspenseful or horror-based really at all in that game. There were, like, some minuscule portions, honestly. And that's it. And it was incredibly disappointing to me. I think that's the only Resident Evil game where, honestly, I've only played through it like 2 times. And I played through it as Chris. I unlocked the ability to play as Sheva, and then I played it and I beat it as her. And that was really it. And I may have played like the mercenary modes, but that's it. I had like no insane, passion to keep going through the gameplay. It's not like the other games where I've pretty much any Resident Evil game I've owned, I've beaten multiple times, except maybe like, I think Code Veronica is like the only other one. And that's mostly because Code Veronica doesn't really have a ton of unlockables like the other games do, where it's like alternate costumes you can find in secret areas, or the special mercenary modes, which give you the ability to basically buy new weapons to play through in the main campaign, stuff like that. And that's really the only reason for Code Veronica. It's kind of exactly the same all the time, and there's like some minor unlockables here and there. But that's really it. And then for Resident Evil 5, it's just the simple fact that I don't really enjoy it as much as I do the other Resident Evil games because it has no suspense. It wasn't like Resident Evil 4 wasn't like horror, survival horror or anything, but it had really, really creepy moments. It had incredibly disturbing enemies, especially those regenerating ones, I think. If you play that, that probably like just messed with you every time you saw them. But those were incredibly creepy. They had like just really good scary portions, at least in that game. And then 5 came out and it's like, you know, I don't like to use the fact that it was daylight, you know, through most of the game as a reason to not like it. But it was the fact that it's like, you know, it's broad daylight, it's super sunny, and it's just not scary. Like, it can be broad daylight, it could be as bright as you want it to be, and you can still make a game creepy and scary. You could be, you know, going through a survival horror game in the, you know, 8 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't matter. It could still be scary. It was just the fact that it wasn't scary at all. Like, it was broad daylight. It might have been creepier if it was darker because you have all these enemies coming at you and you really can't see. It would make it admittedly scarier if it was all really, really dark at nighttime. But, you know, it's just broad daylight. You can see everything and hit everybody. The enemies aren't super duper scary except for like the chainsaw guy and the one with the giant hammer. But it was just really disappointing. And then like the one portion, there are like 2 moments where it's actually nighttime. And the first time is when you fight like the enemy they basically just reused from 4. And all you do is sit in the tank and shoot at it and shoot at other random enemies behind you or behind the boss. And that's really it. And then there's another cutscene and then it's daytime again. You go through the game and then the end boss battle is once again at nighttime, and it was just a really disappointing game to me. But I'm excited for whatever they do with the next numbered Resident Evil. I enjoyed 6. I know there were some issues, even, you know, as a huge fan of Resident Evil, there's still some issues. Like the QuickTime event thing, I think everyone can agree that that was just kind of stupid, in some places at least, because for the most part, QuickTime events are kind of just dumb in general for the most part, except for maybe the actual button mashing portions. But when it's just like, you know, hit a button to like open a door, literally like the first one in the game is you hit the button just to pick somebody up, and it's like, it's not like they're just standing there. It's like you hit the button after he's like halfway reached his hand out, and then you hit the button and then they finish like, oh, okay, now we can do it. And it's like, why couldn't that easily just be a cutscene or just not there at all? Like, of course, like QuickTime events in general are always just like really weird. Like I said, except for the button mashing things when it's like a character is actually fighting back against something, or it is like a QuickTime event where you actually are dodging or blocking something like they did in Resident Evil 4. I thought those were actually well done because it's just like survived this little cutscene, but it wasn't like the entire game or anything. It was really only, you know, tap button mash to run faster and then dodge at the last second, or survive inside of this cutscene, which I thought was actually pretty cool because, you know, even though it was the middle of the cutscene, it was still kind of gameplay, and it was actually a nice balance because it didn't happen all the time. And then when it was in gameplay, it was really just like, do a quick dodge here, press this button. So it wasn't just like, oh, QuickTime events. It was actually in the gameplay. It was like, okay, this feels nice. And then for 6, it was just like every freaking thing. And even in 5, I thought it was okay because it was like, you know, push this boulder is basically building up your strength just like you do when you run. And, you know, it kind of made sense. And then in 6, it was just like everything almost had like QuickTime events to it. But, you know, to kind of move on from disappointing games to disappointing movies based on video games, my second topic is why it's so incredibly hard for people to make good movies based on video games. And I was thinking about this a couple of days ago, and I was just going through, I don't know why I was randomly thinking about this. I was going to sleep, and of course, the last thing you do when you first get in bed is just stop thinking and fall asleep. So I'm just, you know, ideas randomly shooting off in my head, and I was just started thinking about video game movies. And the analogy that I actually came up with for why it's so hard for people to make good movies based on video games is that with a book that's turned into a movie, just like with a video game, there's a ton of stuff that gets cut out. There's like all these different moments. It's like they have to pick what is 100% crucial. Like, you can give a character an item and have it come from someone else if you switch it around from the book to the movie, and it still works. And all these little moments that might be really great for fans of the books and things like that, they're not exactly essential. It's like, yeah, this happened, but we can't spend like 30 minutes talking about this one character that handed the main character an item, so let's just leave that out. It matters. They got this thing and now it matters. But for video games, doing that, even though it's much easier, it's the in between stuff that's actually really difficult, because with a book, the in between the story is just turning a page. You're on page 8, you turn the page, it takes you a second, and boom, you're at page 9. From page 8 to 9, it took you a second to turn the page. That's all you had to do. You could have stopped. You wouldn't have found out what happened in the rest of the story. You would have had from page 1 to 8, and then you'd be done. That's all you would know. And in a video game, going from page 8 to 9 takes like an hour, because when you turn a page in the video game world, you're playing it. You play through all of these different portions, which don't really count. Like all the filler and all that stuff that comes from a book, all of that stuff we play inside of video games. It's crucial in certain elements, because it's like in some of the gameplay portions, the story can come to life. Like in Half-Life, I think it's a great example. There aren't really cutscenes. You do play through all that stuff, but there are still moments you could cut out. Like if you're just walking from point A to point B, if you cut that out in the film, they get from point A to point B. But if there are a bunch of enemies, then getting from point A to point B might take us as players about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how far point A is from point B, how many enemies there are, how tough the enemies are, what weapons they have, what weapons you have, and bullets and height and all these insane variables. And then in the movie world, it's just like, all right, point A to point B, how many enemies do we have? Boom, boom, boom. Now they're at point B. And there's so much that gets taken out of a video game that it's just really weird to experience, and it's weird to have all that stuff just condensed compared to what's taken out of a book. Like I said, you have page 8 to 9, you're turning a page for a second, and then you get the rest of your story again. But from page 8 to page 9 in the video game world, you're playing like 10 minutes worth of just traversing from point A to point B. Maybe you get from this field to this building, and you're fighting enemies along the way, and all these crazy things that are very minuscule if you saw them visually, because it's like, I don't want to see this person duck down behind, like some wooden boxes and shoot 5 people for 10 minutes because they have to constantly pop up and duck down and stuff. But when you're playing that, it's incredibly intense. It's like, crap, I only have a little bit of health and stuff like that. I could actually die. And then watching it in a movie is like, well, of course he's not just gonna be like, oh crap, I could die here, and then get shot and then just boom, restart the game. It's not gonna happen in the film. We know exactly what's gonna go down because it's the main character, unless the main character dies, in which case that could be, done well in the film, I think. I mean, you could kind of switch when they die. I think that would be like the smartest way to handle it. But with video games based, or with movies based off of video games, it's so weird how it's difficult to condense the story. Like a book and a game, probably have the same amount of content. Most likely, if it's a book being turned into a movie, the book probably has like way more content than a video game would, at least script wise. It would have far more content. It's like, all right, we have to cut out this paragraph, this and that, and then we just follow literally the book. We follow the actions, we follow the script. We might change, how certain things look and this and that, but that's it. It's very simple. And then in a video game, all of that stuff you kind of have to interpret. It's like, okay, there's this giant chunk of gameplay where the character's alone for nearly an hour, and they go from, like I said, from this field to this building, and it's like this field is like a cornfield or something, and then they're traveling. They find this car, they hotwire it, they steal it, they drive to this building, which is in this rundown city, but this is where whatever random deal is happening. And that takes an hour worth of gameplay. While they're driving, they get caught by some of the enemies from the game. They kill these enemies. They run into one of the main antagonists within the game. It might not be the main enemy, but the sub-enemy or whatever, the right-hand person to the main antagonist. They have a scuffle with them. Neither of them die. They leave the sub villain behind and they escape. They get to this place, and then, boom, we have our next cutscene, and that was an hour later. And then they have to translate that all into a movie, and it's like, how do we make this unbelievably amazing portion of a game, which could be like the highlight of the game, gameplay wise? How do we make that unbelievable inside of a film? And it's hard to do that. And then you have to keep doing it where you make these unbelievable locations within the video game amazing visually for people to watch, where they don't control it. It's just like, all right, well, I know the main character isn't going to die, so you have to make this even better than it was in the game when you really think about it. Because I can die 12 times over, but I'm going to be able to start over and eventually be able to beat these enemies. But that sort of tension isn't in a movie, especially when it's based off of something that we already know. We know the character's going to survive, even if it's not in pretty much any television show or movie in general. We always know the main people are going to survive anyway. But in something like that, where you are translating a game into a movie, which is already, we have books, and like I said, this is of course like the best analogy I can give is with books, and with books being the way that they are and then being translated into movies so often. With books, we have a nice level of simplicity. It's not exactly simple to translate from a book to a film, but we have a nice constant level of simplicity where people can go through, and it's like, okay, we want this, we don't want that, so let's take this stuff out. And then when it comes to video games, all that simple stuff is very difficult to find, because the simple stuff really is what we play. Like, we play the simple stuff, and the main components are the cutscenes. All the cutscenes basically go from game to movie, very easy. And then the quote-unquote simple stuff is every single moment in between, which when you think about it, unless it's like, Metal Gear, which has like hours upon hours of cutscenes, that's basically maybe 4 or 5 hours out of 12 hours. Not even 4 or 5 hours, really. Probably like an hour and a half out of a 10-hour experience. You have like 5-minute cutscenes here and there and stuff like that. And that's why I personally feel it's so hard for people to make great movies based on great video games. And there are some good ones out there. Personally, I love the first Resident Evil movie. I think it was a pretty good one. I don't like the others because they don't really have anything to do with Resident Evil. The second one does. And, the first 2 Resident Evil movies I think are good as far as following the story. Like the first one, it's in the mansion. They, of course, switch some stuff around. And they don't really have like any of the characters from the movies until the second, or from the game until the second movie. And the second one, and I hate the second one, but what I love about the second movie is all the stuff that's just like, boom, here's everything that basically we left out from the first movie. So they have all the characters, and I mean, not all the characters, but they have like, Jill, we get to meet Jill. They have Carlos in there. They have Nikolai and Mikhail, so basically all the mercenaries. And it's pretty much, the second movie is Resident Evil 3, the video game. So they kind of skip over 2 because, of course, that just takes place in a police station. So that would be a weird movie if they were just trapped in the station. But it was really cool. Like, we got to see these characters from the game. We got Nemesis, and we got cool references to Code Veronica, stuff like that. I really thought it was amazing, but I hated the movie because they made it like way too funny, and it just really made me mad. Like, they had Mike Epps. I love Mike Epps. He's really funny, but you don't put Mike Epps as just hilarious, funny Mike Epps in a horror movie, like in Resident Evil. It doesn't make any sense. So I really hated the second movie, and after that they got better, even though they have like nothing to do with the games. I still enjoy them just as campy Resident Evil films, but the first one I actually thought was pretty good. I saw the Prince of Persia movie. I actually thought that was pretty well done for the Prince of Persia franchise. I thought it was actually pretty well written, and I thought it followed it kind of as best as it could. I think it changed a ton of stuff around from the Prince of Persia games, or like the trilogy that was remade for when like Xbox first came out. But I thought that was pretty well done as well. And then you have a ton of other video game movies that are just like, kind of just weird and crazy and stuff like that. But there are just so many great games out there, and it's weird to see them translated so poorly into movie form. And I know it's hard. Like, some people just kind of suck. Like, Uwe Boll, he makes video game movies that are just terrible. But for people who do at least try, you can get some entertaining stuff out of that. And I know it's difficult because, like I said, turning the page from point A to point B in a book, 1 second, but from point A to point B in the main story of a video game, that can be an hour long for us. It's playing through the character going up this mountaintop, or playing through the character fighting through this insane army, or going from the bottom of a building just to the top of a building. It could be insanely fun for us, and it'll take like 45 minutes to an hour depending on if you die and this and that. And in a film, it's like we can't exactly spend 45 minutes on this amazing portion of this game because we don't have 10 hours to tell this story. We have maybe 2, like, really, because I don't think I've ever seen a video game movie that was even 2 hours. I think they all kind of stick in that, like, just barely under 2 hours, like the 145 limit, which I think is like about as short as it gets for movies, maybe an hour and a half. But video game movies tend not to go beyond that, and there probably are some out there that I just haven't seen because admittedly I don't try to watch video game based movies. But it was just something that's been on my mind lately, and I really wanted to talk about it because, as someone who loves video games, of course, I want to see a great video game movie, and I think there are, of course, a ton of people who do, and I really wanted to be off of a very interesting franchise. Like, I know there's stuff with, like, Assassin's Creed was supposed to be getting made, and I don't know what happened with that, but I think that could work because it's sort of based in reality, and it would depend on how they did it. If they did it like the games where it's split between the current era and the past, with characters actually going into the Animus, or if it was solely in the past where they had no idea about the Animus and anything like that, I think that would easily work as well. But I was excited for that stuff with like Uncharted. I love Uncharted as it is, and it's basically based off of like Indiana Jones, where it's just a funny treasure hunter guy who's just doing his thing and he gets into trouble. That's pretty much what Uncharted is. I don't think we need that as a movie because we kind of already have that as Indiana Jones. But I'm sure they could easily make that work as well because of how simplistic that is. But even those games have like amazing, depth to them. And honestly, all the examples I was giving, I was kind of thinking of Uncharted because there is so much that goes on in that game that easily could be skipped over if it's just like, here's the cutscenes. You'd miss so much of the game. It's like, look at all these beautiful locations they go to, and if you skip over cutscenes, there's just so much gone. Or if you only skip and watch all the cutscenes, there's just so much that you miss. You might see them go to like this house, like in the third game, they go to this house, but really there's like nothing going on in that house. Like, that whole thing for the most part is really just you're going through that house and exploring stuff until like the last portion when the enemies finally show up. And it would be so hard to translate that into a film where you're going through these 15, well, really that is a great chunk of that game. It's like an hour at least, and there's really nothing happening. It's like Drake and Sully, they're kind of just there, they're chatting it up, and that's pretty much it. I think actually Drake might be by himself in that part of the game for a big chunk of it. They kind of get split up, and it's just so hard to translate that portion of the game, which is huge compared to like a film itself only being, say, 2 hours. That's a lot to use because that in itself was about an hour's worth of that game, and that's like a prime example. It's so hard to condense these ever-changing moments where it's just like, in an hour you go to this mansion, you get split up, you almost get killed by like crazy man-eating spiders, the mansion gets set on fire, you have to fight enemies through the fire, you have to jump out of this burning building. All that stuff happens in like an hour, and then what do you do? Like, cut that down to like 15 minutes or just not include it? Like, stuff like that is why I think it's so much harder to make great movies based on video games compared to great movies based on books. It's just so much harder to really know what is essential and what isn't, because in a video game, pretty much everything is. There are points in games, like even in Uncharted 3, there is a point like when you're on the ship, really that is kind of just like pointless. Like, they could easily take that out if they made that into a movie, but at the same time, that's an amazing portion of that game. That's one of the best parts of the game, because even though it kind of is just literally, it's just a wild goose chase for the game, it's unbelievable. It's like, it's incredibly cinematic. You're on this giant cruise ship that's empty, and it's kind of creepy in a little sense. If you kind of think about it in a creepy way, it's a little creepy, but it looks really amazing. It's dynamic, and the boat's rocking, and you can actually feel it. And that's just, from a gaming perspective, it was really cool to experience that. And that's one of those other little things that doesn't exactly translate into a movie. It's like, oh, I've seen a boat rock on a movie before. It's not the same thing as, playing the game. And it's like, wow, you can actually see items shift left to right when you're standing on this boat, and just those minute details. And then that overall portion of that game in general, it's one of those things where it's like, how do we condense this amazing portion into something that's 10, 15 minutes long, or even 30 minutes, but find a way to make it even more relevant to the film, even though even in the in the game itself, it's not exactly 100% relevant. So I can't wait till we get one that's amazing. I wish that we already had one, of course. I think everyone does. I wish all the ones we've had were unbelievable movies. I think a really great example is like the Halo Forward Unto Dawn. I remember when I first watched that after all the portions actually came out and they just officially released it as one film. When I saw that, I was like, man, I wish this just came out at movies, because that would have been like the first, great movie based on a video game. And it wasn't like, here's Halo 1 as a movie. It was, here's something within the Halo universe as a film. And it was unbelievably well done. I love that movie. If you haven't seen it, even if you don't like Halo, you have to see that movie, because it's just well written, it's well done, and it's really fun to watch. And that was one of the things I was like, man, I just wish this came out in theaters as an official full-length movie, so we could all say like we have that first great video game movie. But sadly we don't. But there's some great things out there, and I can't wait till we get one. Thanks for listening to this one, guys. Of course, I want to know your thoughts. Games that have really disappointed you, games, even if they were just bad games, it was like, your expectations were low and it still somehow, got worse. Please put that down in the comments below. What do you guys think about video game movies? Of course, I think everyone who's a gamer, even if you're not a gamer, you probably have some thought process on that, and how it's just weird that these movies, like, we can have such amazing movies. We can have crappy movies based off of books as well, but it seems like as far as video game movies go, they all tend to suck except for like a few random gems. And even those, like the Resident Evil one is like a typical horror movie. I think it wouldn't really scare a bunch of people, but it was a fun movie. The Prince of Persia one, it changed a ton of stuff. It was more like a interpretation of the game more than anything, or the, I guess, initial story, because I believe that came from something way before the games. But like all these different things, I'm sure a lot of you guys have thoughts about it. So please put all your thoughts down in the comment section below. If you guys have any topics you want me to talk about, nerdy or not, please put those down in the comment sections below. And of course, thanks for listening.